that.
Our next speaker is Dr. John Wingfield, who is Assistant Director for Biology at the National Science Foundation.
Thank you very much, and delighted to be here on this day, and congratulations on 60 years to the Institute and all the work that it has done over the decades for animal care and welfare. What I'd like to do today is give you a slightly different perspective, or a very different perspective, depending on how you look at it, from the National Science Foundation, in which we are a funder of basic research, fundamental research, and we essentially address four major areas as outlined in a National Academy report a few years ago, and these are health, food, energy, and environment. And if you look across the directorate, wild animals are used in this research, as well as the more regular common laboratory animals across these four areas. And what I'd like to do is give you that perspective, and what I'd like to do first of all is just give some ideas of where wildlife research is continuing to expand. Dimensions of biodiversity. This is an ongoing program we have to try not just catalog biodiversity, but look at other dimensions, including metabolic pathways. Genome to phenome. Perhaps one of the ultimate frontiers in basic biology, how you go from a genome sequence, epigenome, to an actual functioning organism in its environment. Organism-environment interaction and perturbations of the environment. One thing that is very clear to us now, I think last year and this year, that one of the products of global climate change is the increasing frequency, duration, and intensity of weather events, to say the least. Droughts, heat, floods, tornado swarms, hurricanes, and so on and so forth. It's curious that responses of organisms to perturbations of the environment, comparative biology of stress, has such implications for biomedicine, agriculture, and conservation biology. As far as I know, there is no center anywhere in the world that has a focus on that comparative biology. And yet we are actually funding a lot of research in that area that has implications for welfare of animals, and I'll come back to that point in a moment. Epigenetics, field and laboratory investigations, the BRAIN Initiative, which was rolled out by President Obama on April 2nd this year, a number of neuroethical implications here, especially as the tools that allow us to probe the nervous system and the brain. And as the engineers claim, we're beginning to decode electrical signals into thoughts. I'm not quite sure I believe that, but that's what they claim. In terms of working with animals, a lot of the basic research and the tools that are developed will involve animals, and this includes some wildlife. So there is this increasing profile on wild animal research. Just to give you some perspective, we think there are somewhere almost 20,000 people in the US that are zoologists who work with vertebrate wildlife, which are the ones that concern us, really. And NSF Bio funds about 65% of the non-medical biological research in the United States, and much of this is on wild vertebrates in both the field and the laboratory. These animals are critical for this basic research for not only health and food, but also conservation in the face of global climate change, invasive species, habitat degradation, and urbanization, and so forth. So these are all issues of our time. What I'm going to do now is just take a couple of minute break and give you an example to make a point, because I don't think this always gets across quite as well as it should. And in the interest of full disclosure, this comes from some of my own research. I am an active professor also at the University of California in Davis, and I've done a lot of work throughout my career on vertebrates, from fish to mammals. And this is a collaboration with the French polar programs, particularly Frédéric Angelier, at their Antarctic field station, East Antarctica. So you see here that this is the ice cap, and these islands here are just full of birds and mammals, such as seals, penguins, petrels, and so forth. And the waters are full of fish. And these are of interest for a number of reasons. Global climate change is occurring far more rapidly at the poles than it is anywhere else. And there are also a lot of natural resources, particularly the fish, that many countries are interested in exploiting. I'm going to focus in on one animal here. This is this amazing creature. It's called a snow petrel. It spends its entire life in Antarctica at the edge of the pack ice, including in winter. And the reason why we were interested in this animal is that they are very long-lived and they form permanent pair bonds. We can put aluminum bands on their legs here, and the French have been banding these birds for 55 years, and they live about 50 years. So they are long-lived. They're a good model for aging in the natural world. And they lay their eggs and incubate their eggs under these rock piles, and this is where they raise their chicks. So they're a fairly tractable animal to use. But there are some ethical implications there for an animal that lives 50 years and has a permanent pair bond. Then this happened. It's not infrequent that you get very extreme weather events at any time in the Antarctic, and here we have a petrel sitting on its egg, and as the storm raged, blew snow underneath this. You can see the blue marker here underneath into its nest site, completely covering that bird. Temperatures dropped down to about minus 15 Celsius and very high winds. To us, this is an extreme event. You're talking about occupational health and safety. There's another issue. We have to be very careful that we train all of our personnel for these kinds of events. Now, although this is an extreme event for us, it's not a problem for this bird. It was quite fine underneath this snowpack, and it actually hatched a chick while it was underneath that snow. The problem came the next day. The temperature soared to 7 degrees Celsius, and it rained. 7 degrees Celsius equaled the record high temperature ever recorded in 55 years at this spot, and it's only the third time it had ever rained. And the snow melted and the water running down under the rocks. Here's a bird that's absolutely drenched, mostly because the water was flowing against the lie of the feathers. Here are eggs that were washed out. Here was a chick that was hatching that died. And here we have a bird sitting in a pool of ice water trying to incubate an egg. Eventually, these birds abandoned their nests. There was 95% failure of that colony. This is a critical event. This is an extreme event for them. For us, 7 degrees and raining is not so bad. But for these animals, it was an extreme event. I give this as an example because we need to know what's happening to these animals during these kinds of events. There are really no guidelines for us to do that. There are the older guidelines that have been put out by Jim King and his colleagues that Dr. Brown mentioned for wild birds, and that was our Bible, so to speak, for many, many years, and it has been updated since. But for this kind of research, where these kinds of events are happening more and more, and now we think we have to study them more and more, this is something I think is a challenge for us to think about how we're going to go about doing it. Because they are unpredictable, we can't plan either. So we can't ask the ear cook to approve a protocol where we're going to look at this. It might be 3 years before it happens. There are all sorts of issues. So having said that, if we look at the existing animal care and use guidelines, some of them we've also already seen: the Guide for Care and Use of Laboratory Animals, the ILAR use, the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee Guidebook, the Panel on Euthanasia, and then there are these guidelines that the professional vertebrate societies have put out on the use of wild fish in field research, live amphibians and reptiles, birds, and also mammals. The ILAW has certainly included these in the mix for institutional animal care and use committees to use to assess protocols for wildlife biologists. And I think there's a big challenge here because there is a revolution going on in wildlife research, well, in biology in general, with a lot of nanotechnology, new sensors. These are used in biomedical contexts as well as in ecological, environmental contexts, where the radio transmitters are getting smaller and smaller, that we can follow small animals from space. A lot of these recorders will transmit heart rate, vocalizations, body temperature. There are others, nanosensors, that are picking up urea, that are picking up glucose and so forth. So there are all sorts of sensors and probes that we can use in these animals that we never had the capability to do before. So these are things that we need to think about, I think, in terms of future research. So one thing we did very recently at the NSF was we added new language in our grant proposal award and policies and procedures guide, that when research involves the study of wildlife in the field or the lab, the organizations, the institutions will follow taxon-specific guidelines. This is in addition to the ILAW guidelines, but those that have been published to cover the fishes, the herps, birds and mammals, as is appropriate for the taxon to be studied. These are not the only manuals. We heard from APHIS and the USDA. They have their guidelines too. So does the United States Geological Survey. Here, one of their chapters here is Guidelines for Proper Care and Use of Wildlife in Field Research. As you can imagine, sometimes these things don't jive across all the agencies. But one thing I would like to do at this point too is congratulate ILAW for publishing very recently this issue on the ethical and IRCUC considerations for field biology studies. I see this as really a tremendous advance, that we're starting to bring wildlife biologists more into the fold here to discuss issues such as those that I've outlined. Next steps, urgent issues. Over the years, and I have, like I say, I am a professor as well as heading the biology directorate at the National Science Foundation, and I'm fully aware of a lot of these issues. When I was at the University of Washington, I served for 7 years on the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee. I chaired it for 4 of those, and I had a lot of long debates with animal care people and the attending veterinarians, and how we would bring wildlife research into the overall picture for approval of those protocols. And despite this, it is still unfortunate that there is frequently frustration for PIs that are working with wildlife, just because situations like I showed you with the snow petrel are very far removed from a mouse or a rat in a cage. And even with the occupational health and safety issues, working out there in the field is often very, very different from what you would encounter in the laboratory. And it's the main point I'm going to make here is that it's an uneven relationship here. Some institutions are tremendous, like UC Davis, the chair of the Animal Care and Use Committee, is a wildlife vet. So he works in the field and he understands fully, but at other institutions you don't have that kind of resource. So there are problems there. How can we get around that? Also, it's often, I've called it here, inadequate and unrealistic consideration of field conditions and the ethics of working with wildlife under extreme conditions and so forth, still remains fairly open, and we need to think that through. So I'm going to end with this point here, that I think there are a lot of challenges here. Wildlife research has a lot to offer in terms of environment and as well as health, food and energy. And how do we work with ILAW and get things moving in the right direction? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Our final panelist, and also a longtime colleague and friend, is Dr. Margaret Landy, who is Chief of Animal Welfare, Ethics, and Strategy for the pharmaceutical industry in general, and for GlaxoSmithKline in particular. Margaret.